Okay, we're going to get started here. I know more students will be trickling in, and faculty and staff, but good morning. And for those of you that don't know me, my name is Vincent Antandi. I'm an associate professor of history here and director of our Institute for Race, Justice, and Community Engagement at MC. Just a few housekeeping notes. Please make sure that you silence your cell phones. There will be books available for purchase right after this event in the lobby. And there's also attendance certificates for any students, sign-in sheets for any faculty, staff that needs to sign that as well. I'd first like to thank a couple of the people that really helped make this event possible. Dean Sharon Fechter and our amazing provost, Dr. Brad Stewart, Kim McGettigan, Siobhan Quinn in the Cultural Arts Center, and Kimberly Herrera in Student Life. And thanks to Student Life, the first 30 students that came in here today got a free copy of Dr. Kendi's book. So make sure that you give a thanks to Student Life when you see them. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. And where to really begin? At 34 years old, Ibram Kendi is already so accomplished that to look at his bio, it's quickly becoming a short book. I could pretty much go on and on about this. Dr. Kendi is, of course, an award-winning scholar of racism and anti-racism and a New York Times best-selling author. His second book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, won the 2016 National Book Award for Nonfiction, and he is the youngest to ever win this award. This book was also a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, a Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and an NAACP Image Award. Stamped was named to several best books of the 2016 lists, including the Boston Globe, The Root, the Washington Post, and BuzzFeed. The Washington Post also named Stamped the most ambitious book of 2016. Professor Kendi is also the author of the award-winning book, The Black Campus Movement, and has published numerous essays in books and academic journals, also commentaries for the New York Times, Salon, Time Magazine, the Washington Post, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. You've probably seen him on a number of TV and media appearances, from NPR to PBS, CNN, the BBC, Al Jazeera, Democracy Now!, just to name a few. He's also the co-editor of the Black Power series with NYU Press, and is the associate editor of Black Perspectives. And his next book will be published by One World Random House. It is right now tentatively titled How to Be an Anti-Racist, a Memoir of My Journey. On a personal note, I think in some way having Dr. Kendi here today was inevitable. I had followed Dr. Kendi's career from afar, and when he was in Florida at the University of Florida, I was also teaching in Florida at Seminole State in Orlando. And then when I came back up here to DC, I was delighted to find out that now Dr. Kendi was going to be teaching and running his new center at American University, which is my alma mater. So as soon as he came up here, I wanted to reach out and make sure that I brought him here. The other piece is, as we were just opening here our new Institute for Race, Justice, and Community Engagement, Dr. Kendi was founding the new Anti-Racist and Policy Center at American University. And so my hope is that not only so many of you students will then transfer on to American University and study under Dr. Kendi and contribute to this new center he's created, but also that today will be the beginning of our faculty and our students and our centers working together in this city to create a more just and equal world. It is my pleasure and my honor to introduce to you Dr. Ibram Kendi.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm truly honored to be here. I'm honored to receive this invitation, Vin, and I'm truly excited about the new center that has been founded here. And I hope that each of you would participate in that center and then have the experience and then transfer to AU and participate sort of in our center. It'll sort of be the best of both worlds. Because one of the things I think we should all know is that there are three things that are literally threatening human existence right now: nuclear war, climate change, and inequality. And so when you partake in this center, you are literally partaking in the future of humanity itself. And so I'm so excited again for this new center, Vin, and thank you again for inviting me here to speak to you all. Is everyone okay? I'm a little weirded out since I just made a fool of myself tripping, but I'm trying to recover. I should have just stood over there so I didn't rush, so I wouldn't have had to rush over there. But again, I want to sort of speak to you very briefly about some of the major ideas and findings from Stand from the Beginning, and really speak to you in a larger sense about really how to understand something that I think many Americans believe they already understand, which is racism. And in writing a history of racist ideas, and I didn't say a history of racism, a history of racist ideas, I very quickly realized that every idea that I was going to chronicle, every racist idea, that those who articulated those ideas typically did not think those ideas were in any way racist. And so whether that's slaveholders saying that enslaved Africans are in their sort of God-ordained condition as the cursed descendants of Ham, or whether they were saying that black people are better off in American slavery than African freedom, whether it was segregationists trying to imagine that the South was separate but equal, or stating that black people as a racial group are not fit to rule, are not fit to be in politics, and that's why they're mass disenfranchised, and that's why for nearly 50 years of this country's existence, a large percentage of black people were denied the ability to vote, let alone hold political office. Whether it's mass incarcerators saying that the reason why so many black people have been incarcerated over the last 40 years is because so many black people are criminal-like. Black people are dangerous. Their neighborhoods are dangerous. They have this sort of danger gene. Or they come from these broken, diabolical families that produce super predators, predators that we, of course, as a nation have to guard against. Whether, no matter who it was, even if the President of the United States is calling black and Latino nations S-holes, they still then follow that up by saying, I'm the least racist person you've ever interviewed. Anybody heard that when President Trump said that? Or I'm the least racist person you've ever known. That's actually quite consistent. This consistent denial, or this consistent belief that one's own ideas are not racist, that one's ideas are logical, one's ideas are reflective of scripture, one's ideas are reflective of statistics, one's ideas are reflective of nature. And so in very simply sort of trying to grapple with a history of racist ideas, simply defining a racist idea was extremely controversial. Everybody understand how that would be controversial? Because nobody wants to admit that their ideas about black people are racist. People want to just say whatever they want to say, and then when they're challenged that those ideas are racist, they, of course, want to say, no, it's the truth. And here's my one single anecdote that proves it's the truth. I know a lazy black person, so black people are lazy. And so it results in a problem, in a difficulty of simply defining a racist idea. So I ended up defining a racist idea very simply as any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. Any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. And I also wanted to distinguish in Stand from the Beginning, and in my work more broadly, between a racist idea and a racist policy. And so when we think about racism, what you're really thinking about is the marriage between racist policies and racist ideas. A marriage that is empowered by power, racist power. And so I wanted to sort of show the ways in which these two constructs interact. What is their relationship like? What has been their relationship historically? Racist ideas and racist policies. And I define racist policies as any policy that yields a racial inequity. Everybody heard that? Any policy that yields a racial inequity. And so I don't necessarily define a racist policy in the way discriminators would prefer we define it, based on its intent. And the reason why I don't do that is precisely because the very discriminators who I understand as racist have defined it in that way. So why would we use their own definition? And why did they define it in that way? Because it's easy to hide intent. It's quite easy. Maybe easy is too strong, but it's much more difficult to hide outcome. In other words, your policy yields a scenario in which there's very few black people in your college or in your place in your job or in your institution or in your community. You can't hide that, but you can hide the intent behind the policies that yielded that. And so as a result, particularly over the last 50 years, but even before that, discriminators have sought to hide their intent. So even the Jim Crow voting laws, from poll taxes to grandfather clauses to literacy tests that more or less disenfranchised black people and many poor white people for roughly the end of Reconstruction until civil rights, they had no racial language in those policies. And they're still widely today considered to be racist policies because of what they yielded. They yielded the mass disenfranchisement of black people. And so those, particularly after the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, an act that more or less made it illegal to practice intentional discrimination like we saw on Southern businesses with white-only signs. They simply just took down the signs and continued to sort of figure out ways to practice discrimination. And so I'm saying this because I think it's critical to understand racist ideas and what it truly is, and racist policies. Because if you don't really have a definition of a racist idea or racist policy, or your definition is based on your own ideas and on your own policies. In other words, I'm going to define racist ideas in a way that excludes my ideas, or I'm going to define racist policies in a way that excludes my policies, which is how people typically do it, then you're essentially never going to be able to, as a nation or even as an individual, address racism. And so in Stand from the Beginning, I not only sort of wanted to define a racist idea, but I also and chronicle the history of these racist ideas, literally from their origins to current day. But I also wanted to distinguish between the producers of racist ideas and the consumers. The producers of racist ideas, those people who are producing these ideas, whether through films, whether through novels, whether through political speeches, whether through scholarly studies, whether through political campaigns, and then people, the masses of people, were consuming those ideas and believing those ideas. So in 1976, when Ronald Reagan ran for president of the United States, he pushed this racist idea of the welfare queen over and over again. And so then people started believing that a lot of welfare recipients, particularly black women welfare recipients, were essentially getting welfare to defraud the government, to make money and become rich off of the government. And so they believed that. They consumed, and then, because black people are corrupt, and welfare is a form of dependence. And people should not be seeking to use welfare, let alone defraud the government by making hundreds of thousands of dollars through it. And so people believed it. They consumed this idea and started believing welfare was bad, and particularly for those black women, because of that idea, even though that idea was sensational. And what I mean by sensational, with anything you're going to have an extreme case. But the vast majority of people, whether those people, no matter the race, were simply using welfare to stay out of poverty, as opposed to using welfare to grow rich. And so I wanted to distinguish, again, between the producers and the consumers. And I decided that I wanted to study the producers of racist ideas. And I wanted to really understand, why were they producing these ideas? You know, what was behind these ideas? And the reason why I wanted to understand this is because we have been taught that what has historically been behind racist ideas is ignorance and hate. In other words, Ronald Reagan was ignorant. He did not know that this woman in Chicago, this black woman in Chicago, was an exceptional case, that you could not find a similar case around the country. He really just was ignorant. He just did not know. Or he hated black people. And so that's why he pushed this idea that slaveholders did not know that it doesn't say anything about race in the story in the Bible in Genesis on Noah and his sons. They just did not know. They did not know that actually freedom in Africa was better for black people than American slavery. That Africa has long been civilized. They just were ignorant. They just, for whatever reason, hated black people. That the reason why people today are pushing voter ID laws and other voter suppression techniques around the country is, we're taught, because they're ignorant. They do not know that voter fraud is not a problem. That we actually have as many reports of alien abduction in this country as we have of voter fraud. They just don't know that. Or they don't, Trump does not know that there are not huts in Nigeria. He just doesn't know. Or they don't know, they're ignorant. That's why they think that Robert E. Lee was an honorable man, right? This is what we're consistently taught. And the reason why we're taught this is because when people say racist things today, just like when they said it yesterday, the reaction is that is hate speech, or they are ignorant. So what that means is that what's really at the core of those racist ideas is ignorance and hate. That's the cradle. And so I wanted to figure out whether that was the case. Is it truly ignorance and hate that is behind racist ideas? And we've also been taught that the reason why people have instituted racist policies, from slavery to mass incarceration, is because of their racist ideas. So they decided to launch a war on drugs, or issue this 1994 crime bill when violent crime was declining, because they just hated black people, or they thought that black people were dangerous. The racist idea led to these policies. So we've been taught that ideas have led to racist policies. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? So we've been taught that really ignorance and hate have led to racist ideas, and racist ideas have led to racist policies. That's the causal relationship that we have been taught. And that, what we have been taught, that relationship then determines our strategy, for undermining racism. Because if this core problem is ignorance and hate, and you want to get rid of racist ideas, you're going to focus on education and love. If you think that racist ideas are leading to racist policies, then you're going to focus on undermining racist ideas to get rid of racist policies. And that's essentially what racial reformers have long done. That's why when people think about racial reform, they think in the realm of education and love armies and programs to mass educate people away from their racist ideas. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Y'all have all lived in this country like I have, right? And so I wanted to see whether that was the case, historically, chronicling the history of every major racist ideas that millions of Americans have consumed. I wanted to understand what was truly causing the production of these ideas. And I found that, generally speaking, it was not ignorance and hate. I found that actually it was racist policies. In other words, I found that historically, the cradle, the causal connection, the origins of racism, this relationship between racist policies and racist ideas has been economic, political, and cultural self-interest. In other words, I found this history, I wrote this history, where really you've had people, powerful people, instituting racist policies out of economic, political, and cultural self-interest. And then those policies were leading to racial inequities. And when we think about any sort of racial inequity, there's only two causes. Either that racial inequity is caused by a discriminatory policy, or that racial inequity is caused by the inferiority or superiority of a racial group. To give an example, over the last 50 years, the black unemployment rate has been twice as high as the white unemployment rate consistently. There's only two causes of that. Either black workers are inferior and white workers are superior, or job discrimination. Those are the only two causes of that disparity in unemployment rates. Either it's the case that black workers are lazy, they don't want to work, they're not qualified, they enjoy welfare more than working. Either there's something wrong and inferior about black workers, or those black workers are trying to get a job and they're basically being denied access to jobs, or there's not as many jobs in their communities as there are other communities. It's only one or the two. And so if you are benefiting from those discriminatory policies and you want people to believe that the inequities that are coming out of your discriminatory policies are not coming out of your discriminatory policies, you're going to produce racist ideas that say that what's causing these inequities is those poor or bad people, not my policy. You're going to produce racist ideas that cause people to think that the problem is people, groups of people, as opposed to your policy. And then people are going to consume those racist ideas. And in consuming those racist ideas, they're going to become ignorant and hateful. And so that's really the history that I show, this history of economic, political, and cultural self-interest, driving the production of an installation of racist policies, and the need to defend them, driving the production of racist ideas, and the consumption of racist ideas, leading to ignorance and hate. And I'm sure everybody can understand this very easily when it comes to slavery. You know, people enslaved people to make money. Now, I know some historians of slavery have tried to make the case that slavery was not profitable, which has just been, anybody who knows anything about how rich slaveholders were before the Civil War knows that it's just crazy. Literally, slaveholders, particularly the very small class of super slaveholders with large plantations and large numbers of slaves, were the richest group of people in the world. And the most powerful group of people in the world before the Civil War. And so, these people wanted to enslave people to make money. But then you had people, whether it was their enslaved people themselves or abolitionists, who were consistently resisting the racist policies that maintained slavery. And so to defend against that resistance, they produced ideas that stated that these people should be enslaved. From roughly about the emergence of the United States to the mid-1830s, there was this idea pushed initially by Jefferson and many of the presidents who admired him, of this idea of slavery as a necessary evil. And then in the mid-1830s, when abolitionists were challenging this idea of slavery as a necessary evil and calling it through a number of different ways, an unnecessary evil. You had people like John C. Calhoun, who was a senator from South Carolina, stand up in front of the U.S. Senate in 1837 and state, "No, Virginia slaveholder, slavery is not a necessary evil. Slavery is a positive good." And then a few years later, a Harvard-trained scholar who interested in psychiatry started studying the 1840 census, a census that identified people who were insane for the first time in the history of the census. So that was a new sort of category on the census, insanity. And so he started looking at the insanity figures and comparing it to race. And he found, Edward Jarvis, that black people were 10 times more likely to be insane in the North than in the South. And then he was like, okay, you know what, this must mean that slavery is good for black people and freedom is driving them insane. No, I just can't make this stuff up, I'm sorry. And so then he published that data and that analysis in some small journal called the New England Journal of Medicine. Anybody know anything about the New England Journal of Medicine? If you know anything about science or medicine, it is the most prestigious medical journal in the world. And of course, John C. Calhoun and others who were pushing this idea of slavery as a positive good. These are major slaveholders who were consistently using violence to maintain slavery, literally. Imagining and pushing publicly that slavery was a positive good before they went back home to their plantations and saw the brutality of slavery. And so then he, was like, you see, this scholar has proven definitively, John C. Calhoun said, that slavery is a positive good. And so Edward Jarvis decided that he was going to continue to sort of look at the data. And the more he looked at the data from the census of 1840, the more he started seeing discrepancies. He started to see that some northern towns had more black insane people than black residents. Everybody understand that? So you had the insanity category, right? You had 500 insane black people. Then in Tacoma, and then, I'm sorry, let me say Philadelphia, because I guess it's the north, right? And then in the number of black residents in Philadelphia, it's like 100. That doesn't compute. You're always supposed to have more residents than anything else, right? So he was like, clearly, there's something wrong here. There's something wrong with this data. We need to investigate this census. We need to change this census. My original idea that slavery is a positive good can no longer sustain itself statistically. And so then he began, and other members who founded what became known as the American Statistical Association started lobbying Congress to investigate the census. At the time, in the early 1840s, the person who was charged with investigating the census was the Secretary of State. It just so happened that the Secretary of State was John C. Calhoun. So John C. Calhoun did what politicians do. They did an investigation, in air quotes, and after his investigation, he found there's nothing wrong with the 1840 census. You just don't want to believe that slavery is good for black people. And so I mention this story because it's either the case that John C. Calhoun, who went to Yale for his undergrad and literally was considered to be among the most brilliant sort of intellectual strategists in pro-slavery America. So outside of this discussion, that's how he historically has been described. He was a brilliant tactician. He was a brilliant thinker. Everything is brilliant, is like everything brilliant, adjective brilliant, brilliant. So it's either the case, right, that he just did not know that slavery was not good for black people, and he just convinced himself otherwise, or he knew precisely that it wasn't good for black people, and he used this theory to defend slavery, to defend those who were resisting slavery as a bad and evil institution. And so I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to conclude that what was actually happening is he was pushing this idea, particularly an idea that emerged in the mid-1830s when the new abolitionist movement emerged on America, that he was pushing this idea to defend slavery. Not because he actually believed it, but because he wanted to defend slavery. And I think if we think about our current sort of political climate, and sort of we apply this to our current political climate, it's either the case that people just do not know that, for instance, African immigrants are among the most highly educated of all immigrant groups, as statistics show, or they continue to describe these people in a way in which they're going to bring down the country. We need a merit system to keep these people out. So they're saying that because they just do not know that actually, people coming from Africa and the Caribbean are actually among the highest educated people who are coming into this country. They just don't know that. Or they know that, but they're trying to basically speak to their base. It's either one or the other. And I guess for me, particularly when you start sort of understanding power and understanding the history of power, you begin to see that it's the job of power to know. It's the job of power to know. I think one of the ways in which I sort of understand this relationship between racist policies and racist ideas is almost like racist ideas is almost like the public relations arm of a company of racial discriminators. And so you have this company produces bad and harmful products, and so you need a very good and a very effective PR arm that makes you and I believe those products are good, or at least not bad. And so some people think that the strategy that we should be using is teaching the executives of that company that those products are bad, educating them so they realize that those products are bad. But those very executives were there at the creation of the product itself. They know more about the product than anyone else. They are the ones who are pushing the PR team to make you and I believe that the product is good for us as opposed to harmful. Like the tobacco companies did not know. They just did not know that it was causing cancer. They just did not know. The executives just had no clue, right? So I think when we think about challenging racism and thereby eliminating inequality, what we should be thinking about is challenging policy and power. And so when you think about undermining racist ideas or even undermining ignorance and hate, our focus should be on challenging or getting into positions of power. Because those who have power, and when I say power, I'm not just talking about political power, like institutional power, economic power. There are many, those who are in power over a student organization, those who are in the SGA. There's many different layers of power, but those who are in power are the people who determine policy. And so when we think about sort of changing and eliminating racism, what I've sort of come to tell you through my research is that if we really want to do that, we should focus again on challenging racist policies and racist power. Thank you. Sure, so I think we have time for questions.
2 mics on each side if you have questions. Go right on.
Hey.
just today being February 21st and the anniversary of Malcolm X's assassination, could you talk a little bit about your journey with him?
Sure. So, so Malcolm X was assassinated in Harlem in 1965 on this day. And I think Malcolm X was sort of critical in my own ideological journey, particularly because I should mention, in Stand from the Beginning and in my work, I actually chronicle two types of racist ideas. And I chronicle not just segregationist ideas, which people more consistently understand as racist ideas. These are ideas suggesting that, let's say, black people are genetically distinct and inferior, that if there's any sort of inequity, it must be the result of black inferiority, that the solution is incarceration or genocide. I actually also chronicle in the text what I call assimilationist ideas. And these are ideas that suggest that there is existence of discrimination, but there's also black inferiority, black cultural or even behavioral inferiority, and that it's incumbent upon black people to be civilized and developed. And more specifically, it's incumbent upon black people to become white, because to become white is to become human, is to become equal. And I mention this in the context of Malcolm X, is because Malcolm X was extremely critical of assimilationist ideas inside and outside of the black community. Those who were literally striving to become white because they saw whiteness as freedom, and those who were advocating that, those who were literally trying to assimilate into society, he was deeply critical of those ideas and critical of those ideas as racist ideas. And of course, those who are asserting those ideas inside and outside of the black community were imagining themselves as well-meaning. And that, what are you talking about? There's no way that slavery did not make black people into brutes. There's no way that poverty is not resulting in all sorts of inferiorities for those people. You know, there's no way. You don't see the way those people act? We need to civilize those poor people. You know, he would challenge them. And that's why he was so beloved among poor black people, who he basically expressed he basically sort of, he described, and I should say championed their humanity, their equal humanity to black elites or white people who were consistently looking down upon them. And so I think for me, I think his message was critical, and I think he was uncompromising. And I think those of you who read Stand from the Beginning, you'll see that really there's almost no one is sort of left off the table as articulating either segregationist or assimilationist ideas about black people. That's everyone from Abraham Lincoln to Barack Obama. And I think I got that sort of boldness and willingness to critique anybody who's saying something negative about black people from Malcolm X.
So on my car ride over, I was flipping through the radio and I happened upon some conservative talk show. And it's like a cup of coffee, it gets you awake in the morning. And they were talking about students walking out of schools today to protest gun violence. And they made an argument in response to the idea that countries like Australia and Japan don't have gun violence because they don't have guns. They said, well, those are homogenous societies. So I wanted you to just respond to that and to that racist thinking that somehow ethnic mixing leads to violence.
Thank you. So the irony is that, even if America would have been a homogenous society, the people who engaged in these mass shootings, most of the perpetrators and victims were the same race. But forget that reality, right? I think that conservative person was getting at. And I think this is the deep contradiction. And that is, when you think about why people are arming themselves, particularly white people, particularly young white males, why they're arming themselves with AR-15s. And what is the ideological makeup of this group of people? Some, though certainly not all, are people who fear that their nation is under attack by terrorists, by Muslims, by Jews, by people of color, by criminals, by women. Their nation, their way of life is under attack, their government. And so they're arming, as a result. Really, it's racist ideas that is sort of playing into, that is feeding their hate, and their hate thereby is causing some of them to arm themselves. The irony is that what then actually happens, at least in recent cases, is that they take out their anger lethally on their own race. And so that's the huge irony, right? And so I think what I'm ultimately getting at is you have a Republican Party that is primarily in power because of white people, and this party is the chief opponent of serious gun laws. And the victims of these gun attacks are primarily white, at least in these recent instances. So how do you sort of put that together? How is that sort of happening? Especially in the context when in the early 1990s, the prototypical or stereotypical holder of the assault weapon was Black or Latino. And then the prototypical victim of gun violence, particularly of assault rifles, were also Black and Latino. And then it led to an assault weapons ban in 1994 that was supported by the vast majority of Americans up until the early 2000s. How does that happen? And I think one of the things we can realize is the way in which, and I think I talk about this at the end of Stand from the Beginning, that this is one of the ways in which racist ideas are actually not in the self-interest of white people. That if the perpetrators of these acts were Black and there was the same victims, in other words, that person who shot up the school in Florida would have been Black, coming from the lower end of Broward County, or if the person who shot up that church in Texas was Black, or if the person who shot up the school in Connecticut, I mean, y'all understand what I'm saying? If they would have been Black, would we be still having the same discussion? Would their race not be even talked about? Would people be describing them as mentally unstable? And so I think what ultimately is happening here is this sort of convoluted scenario in which gun lives are mattering more than white lives. And of course, Black lives have never really mattered, but that's essentially what's happening. And the reason why gun lives matter so much is because of racist ideas.
Hello. So, my generation, as we're called the millennials, right now, as I've been studying more and becoming more aware of a lot of racist ideas and racist policies, I see that our generation, we are going to inherit a lot of these issues, and it will be our responsibility to do something about this. And so, what I wanted to ask you is, not only speaking to me, but also to many others in here, where does progress need to be made in order to see these racist ideas and see these racist policies come to an end?
So I think, in speaking to an individual, I would suggest each of you to, think about of course, what is your passion? Like, what are you already headed towards seeking to do in terms of whether you want to call it, a career or whatever? And I would suggest you not only think about sort of becoming let's say, a professor, but you think about becoming a director of a center, or you think about becoming an administrator. You think about becoming, in that specific field, a person who is in a position of power, who therefore has the capacity and the ability in that specific field to change policy that is discriminating against people of color. That's what I would encourage individuals to do. Now, of course, it's a lot more difficult because a lot more people are competing for that seat of power, right? And so therefore you have to have another layer of motivation. But what I'm saying is, for you to angle for or strive for that seat of power, because that is when you truly will have the ability to not only make a better life for yourself, but even more importantly, make a better life for other people.
Well, Doctor, I'm going to ask you one question. On your book, you wrote that racist policy is the cause for racism. Racist policies are the cause for. What do you think about poverty? Do you think poverty is the cause for racism?
Poverty?
Yeah, poverty.
Yes. I think poverty, particularly the disproportionate amount of poverty within Black communities, is a direct result of racist policies. And so whether we want to talk about how, every year I see reports of something as simple as a Black person who is striving to own a home and they're being denied an ability from racist banks to get a mortgage, or something as simple as poor Black people being forced to travel or commute to their job an hour or an hour and a half, which, for those of you who understand time is money, right, that then results in a lack of an ability for them, let's say, to get a second job or a third job, and therefore save more, and therefore lift themselves sort of out of poverty because the jobs are not in their community, or the well-paying jobs are not in their community. Or something as simple as when Black people, I should say, when emancipation ended, slaveholders in Washington, D.C. received reparations for freeing their captives. Their captives did not receive reparations. And so their wealth, they were able to sort of invest that wealth, and that wealth, of course, has probably grew in size since then, while those people who were actually making the very wealth itself by their very hands were not given anything. And then when they were poor, they were said they were poor because they're Black. Most Black people in 1900 were in the South, and most Black Southerners were sharecroppers. And most sharecroppers were forced, more or less, to They basically, for those of you who aren't familiar with sharecropping, essentially somebody owned the land, you gave them a portion, a share of the crop as almost rent, right? And typically what these landowners would do is they would rent out the tools, the fertilizer, food, other things to these sharecroppers that essentially resulted in, when they were giving them the share, they were in debt. And then the South passed laws that prevented people who were in debt to landowners from moving to another place. So it created what we know as debt servitude, right? Or something as simple as you're getting mass incarcerated for smoking marijuana or even selling low levels of marijuana for 10 years, while somebody else in another neighborhood is not getting incarcerated. And so during that 10-year period, they're able to basically make a living for themselves while you're in prison. Right, and so, I can sort of go down the list, but I think certainly poverty and the disproportionate, I should say, amount of poverty in the Black community is the result of a series of racist policies, past and present.
Hello. So understanding us when you were talking about Malcolm X and thinking about Black elitism and how often it leaves a lot of Black people behind in the instance of Black improvement, how can the privileged Blacks, there are privileged Blacks in the country, how can they dismantle this idea of the good Black versus the bad type of Black and unlearn this idea of being closer to white is equivalent to Black advancement?
Sure. So I think in Stand from the Beginning, I chronicle two different constructs that speak to this. One I call class racism. In other words, when I said the definition of a racist idea, of any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group, and this book is about anti-Black racist ideas, the Black poor are a racial group that is distinct from poor people, right? When you basically racialize any group, you're creating a racial group. And so people say things about the Black poor that they don't say about the poor, just like they say things about Black women that they don't say about women or white women. And so really, when I say racial group, Black poor are a racial group, and Black elites are another racial group. And historically, Black elites have imagined their racial group as superior to that other racial group known as the Black poor. And so that construct I call class sort of racism. Or, so them thinking of themselves as superior, them believing the ideas that white people created about the Black poor. The reason why they're poor is because they're lazy, because they don't want to work, because they don't take personal responsibility. There's also this sense, there's also the class racism of white elites imagining themselves as superior to Black elites. That's another sort of discussion. The second construct that I wanted to sort of speak about, and that I chronicle in the book, is what I call uplift suasion. And so some of you may know it as the politics of respectability. But in the text, I call it uplift suasion for a very specific reason, is because I wanted the term itself to be very direct about what is actually trying to be achieved. In other words, it's this idea that first white abolitionists taught to Black elites, and then Black elites started teaching among themselves, and then started spreading to most of Black America, that essentially that the way Black people act will either reinforce or challenge racist ideas. Specifically the Black poor, who Black elites understand as the basically most inferior people who are actually reinforcing the racist ideas of white people. And so what has actually happened is Black people have been encouraged, and I think anybody sort of who's Black knows this, that when you go into white spaces, you are representing the race by your very behavior. And so when you act in an upstanding manner, you are apparently persuading away racist ideas. When you reinforce stereotypes, you are what? Reinforcing racist ideas. So literally, the image of the race is on your back. And so I chronicle this theory that has been really pushed by Black elites, particularly on the Black poor, because Black poor are more likely to not give a, you know what I mean, in terms of sort of how they're acting. And so I chronicle this theory, a strategy, but I also sort of show that it's based on a racist idea. And that racist idea is that Black people are partially responsible for the racist ideas white people have about them. In other words, the reason why white people think of you as lazy is because you act lazy. Those who champion uplift suasion will say, so you have to stop acting lazy. But the concept or the idea that Black people are lazy is a racist idea. And so this idea that somehow Black people are responsible for the racist ideas that white people have about them makes this case that somehow there's some truth in notions of black inferiority, and to suggest notions of truth in black inferiority is to suggest a racist idea. Secondly, I showed in Stanford in the beginning that this idea of uplift suasion, or I should say this strategy, is literally impossible for black people to execute. And the reason why it's impossible for black people to always act in an upstanding manner is because black people are human. And being human, that means you're imperfect. So even if you may have your lazy day, right, or you may have your day in which you don't, quote, speak right, whatever that means, right? And so you're going to have those days, not because there's something wrong with you, but because you're human, right? And people make mistakes. And so expecting black people to always act in an upstanding manner is essentially trying to create robots that don't exist. And then finally, some black people somehow have been able to do this on some level. And so black people champion these people. But what's ironic is these exceptional blacks are typically viewed as exceptional or extraordinary by racist white people. In other words, they say these people who are acting in this upstanding manner are doing so because they're not really black. They're extraordinary. They're not like those ordinary inferior black people. So even when you do act in this upstanding manner, it doesn't persuade away racist ideas. If anything, it reinforces it. And they say, well, you're not really black. So in anything, what it does is it disconnects you from your own race, right? And so, I not only chronicle this strategy, but I show the ways in which it's racist and the reasons why it failed. And I think this is one of the reasons why the last chapter in the book, which chronicled the rise of Barack Obama, in which many people believe that sort of his public behavior would sort of bring, at least in a profound way, the end of racist ideas, why that failed. Because from the beginning of his public life, people were calling him extraordinary. They were calling, well, he's not really black, that's why. And that's also why black people won't vote for him. And so clearly I think this is a major problem. But I should also say very quickly that black elites refuse to believe that their ideas about the inferiority of the black poor are racist ideas, or even untrue.
I think we have time for one more, so I'm going to take it. And I would just like you for a minute to talk to our students who are hopefully going to transfer to AU, what your goal was in starting this new Antiracist Center, what your plans are for it, where you see it going, and how they, when they become AU students, where they can fit in this. Thanks.
Sure. So I think, as many of you would understand, I think from my research and through the major finding of Stanford from the beginning, that sort of told me and wanted to tell America that our focus should be on racist policies, it was very difficult for me to continue to not be in the space of trying to basically challenge and get installed new policies. And so I think fundamentally that is what sort of drove me to come to Washington, D.C., which is the policy capital and the power capital of the world, to start this anti-racist research and policy center. And essentially what we're going to be doing in the most general sense is we're going to be, particularly at a national, international, and sometimes local level, is we're going to be investigating racial inequities, particularly racial inequities that are extremely harmful to groups of people. And we're going to be investigating those inequities to figure out the discriminatory policies behind them. And once we figure out those policies, we're going to be focused on creating and envisioning new corrective policies that could be put in place of those old policies. And then once we come up with those new policies, we're going to disseminate them, as well as the research undergirding them. And then that's all going to lead up to campaigns of change that literally are going to be focused on figuring out innovative ways to get those policies instituted at a local, national, or international level, probably more local and international based on current national politics. And so we're going to be organized around 6 different policy areas. education, environment, economy, justice, health, and politics. And these teams, these 6 teams, will be made up of these annual sort of groups of scholars, journalists, policy experts, and advocates. So I just described this sort of process of research, of policy creation, of dissemination, and of advocacy, each of which that will be sort of led by the scholar, the policy expert, the journalist, and the advocate. And each of these members of the team will presumably be teaching courses during their fellowship year and during the year that they're engaging in whatever project they're engaging in at AU that will essentially allow their students to become almost like their research teams. And so if the politics team is studying gerrymandering, and the scholar is sort of trying to uncover sort of all of the sophisticated ways in which gerrymandering is occurring in this region or around the country, then the students will, of course, be involved in that very research project in the actual class. And so literally, students will learn by literally doing and being involved in some of the most critical anti-racist projects that are going on right now in the world. And so, I personally, have a lot of faith in students and the capability of students. And that is precisely why I thought the basis, of these teams should be large numbers of students. And I think that will also give students the ability to recognize and to sort of be, again, involved in something that they can presumably talk about for the rest of their lives. And so I'm really excited, about that. And of course, it's going to sort of take time to build up to that point, but we're working on it. Well, I think that the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center is the only policy center of its kind in the United States that is explicitly described as anti-racist. Secondly, I think what makes the perspective of this center unique is the focus, the primary focus on policy change, and the focus on building these 6 teams with non-scholars, with scholars, and students thereby being exposed in their classes to journalists and to policy experts and to activists and advocates. I won't sort of give away some of the people who you could literally take a course from, who are activists, some of whom I'm sure some of you follow currently on Twitter, but I think that is, what makes it unique. And ultimately, I think what makes it unique is literally that all of this work is going to be focused on actual change. And so we're literally going to, running out of the center, these campaigns of change. So we don't want to just create policy or uncover bad policy. We literally want to change it. Yes. I guess there's the last.
I thought we'll give you one more. She's one
Okay.
of our students, so just make comment to the mic. This is your last one. Okay.
So she asked if she has to attend AU to join the work at the center. So it's a hard question for me to ask, because if I say no, then you're like, shoot, I don't need to go to AU, I could just sort of go to whatever school and still be a part. So I'm kind of torn, but I guess to be frank, no, you don't necessarily have to. So we'll probably have student internship programs that we may have student internship programs that will allow students who are not at AU to participate in some of these teams.
Thank you very much.